Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone, gentlemen. I want to apologize at the outset because I am coming off of a very virulent cold and my voice might be a little bit off, so sorry about that. But today I'd like to talk about what I call mainstreamification, specifically with respect to men in the manosphere. But before we go there, I think it's important in general to talk about the principles and the pros and cons of mainstreamification as it applies to other things, other avenues of life. For example, the gaming world. For example, food and fast food. These are some examples we'll get into in a bit on this topic. So let's talk about a particularly infamous example, the example of the mainstreamification of gaming, video games. I'm obviously not the first person to talk about this. Untold numbers of people have addressed this issue, so I'm not claiming that. But what we see really with the gaming world is it started off as something very niche way, way back in the day in the 70s and then the 80s with arcade games. Something that cool people really weren't doing. The jock on the football team in 1988 was not playing Altered Beast at an arcade in 1988. That just wasn't how it worked. And people who played video games, men, because it was almost entirely men, were looked down upon. But over time, the gaming world has expanded. Now, initially, because of financial limitations, you could argue, and a lack of a public to fuel the finances of game development and game production, there weren't many options. But with more and more people interested in games, as a pastime, as a hobby, as a distraction, the amount of money that was flowing into the industry of game development increased. And more men, and people in general, get to the women bit, got interested in the gaming world. As a consequence, you could say, that's good. It got more people interested. There's a pro. It made them more money, which allowed them to expand their ideas. Technology developed as a result as well. All this incrementally, a lot of it in synchronicity with other developments. But eventually, say by the late 90s, gaming is much more popular, and there are a lot of niche things like role-playing games, there are fighting games, there are first-person shooter games, there are a lot of different things. Things that didn't exist as such, say in the 80s, they're expanded upon. The 2000s hit. Still kind of nerdy, kind of niche, but more and more people are interested in it. Eventually you get to the 2010s and it becomes mainstream. And that's when a lot of women start taking interest in games, right? Because women always need social vetting for everything they engage in. So when gaming becomes cool and popular, and when it becomes the most lucrative entertainment business on planet Earth, more than films, more than television, more than anything else, then they say, it's okay, I can game too. No longer an activity for nerds and geeks. In fact, people like Asmongold make millions a year streaming, playing video games. And so it's gotten to the point where you couldn't even argue that playing video games is an actual hobby. It's just something people do. I don't even list that. People say, what do you like to do? I don't say I play video games because I do play video games just because it's such a given. It's like eating, breathing, walking, whatever. So you could say, wow, billions and billions of dollars every year, tons of different games, tons of different genres. The more the merrier, right? It means that there must be a lot of good games out there, even if only half the games are good, even if only a quarter of the games are good. There must be a lot of good ones out there. Not really. A lot of people complain about how games have decreased in quality over the years. And this is a net effect of mainstreamification. Because when you need to cater to the masses, you do in fact need to reduce some of those original qualities that went into the original game. It's no surprise. And so you have to cater to the broadest spectrum of people possible. And in doing so, in this case, particular types of games and genres get reduced to a point where, for a lot of people, especially people who complain about this, the games as they exist today are hardly recognizable as being connected to the original games that they had an interest in when they were playing it way, way back in the day before gaming was popular, socially vetted, etc., etc. There's also, of course, the generational factor, which I will also mention in the context of the manosphere. Different generations have different interests. Very, very few people my age, as I'm pushing 50, have an interest in Fortnite, let's be honest. It's about mainstreamification. It's also about the generational gap, which we will see will repeat itself on the matter of the manosphere. Even food has become mainstream in a lot of ways. Back in the day, not all too long ago, there weren't grocery stores, so you had to farm or hunt or find some other means of acquiring food. But then eventually you get grocery stores, and then eventually you get fast food chains. Fast food chains are mainstreamification of food. They're typically cheap, they're accessible to everyone, they taste okay. I don't eat fast food usually, so I couldn't really tell you what it tastes like. And so it appeals to a broad base of the masses, but nobody is arguing. No one argues that fast food is good or healthy or nutritious. It's almost never. But they acknowledge that it's something you can eat. It serves at the very least the temporary needs of people to satiate their hunger, and so it does the job. But does it have quality? Probably not. It's very difficult in any category of anything you're talking about when it comes to massification and mainstreamification that quality remains. Now, I'm not arguing necessarily that just because something is niche or rare that it is quote-unquote quality, but here's a way of thinking about it. A lot of people still think very highly of mom and pops, diners, shops, things like that. You know, that place where you can get that amazing mashed potatoes and chicken and peas dinner with this incredible apple blueberry pie, but this place only exists in some corner of Philadelphia or whatever. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. They have to compete against the masses, but they have a unique appeal. And oftentimes, the stuff that starts off as being reasonably unique, reasonably contained to a smaller audience, be it food, games, or as we'll get into in a bit, the manosphere, spills out of control in an effort to appeal to the masses. And some of it is totally unintentional. But let's talk about that right now. So as most of you know, the manosphere, way back in the day, way back, even before I started, say 2008, 2009, was much more contained. I think I got officially started in about 2011, thereabouts. But back in those days, say roughly 2009 to 2013-ish, things were very contained. It was very small. It was very niche. And you could easily argue that there was some fairly unique content. A lot of it home-brewed ideas that probably needed to be tested eventually or need to be tested. But the train of thought, the discussion that came out from that time was fairly unique, creative, and a lot of people viewed it as sort of a golden era, golden age of manosphere MGTOW content, and I can see why they would think that. Very few people, especially normies, had heard about it, and it was also a different generation of men. 10 plus years ago, right? These Zoomers who were obsessed with getting laid and looks maxing, right? A lot of them were 10, 9, 11 years old, so this wasn't a huge concern for them. And they existed in a different plane of existence from the rest of us. Now, around 2013, I won't name this person, and needless to say, I'm not a huge fan of him for a variety of reasons. There came a guy who thought it would be a great idea to broadcast MGTOW, and more broadly the manosphere, onto the masses. And he had a special method, and he did all these things to reach as many people as possible. And he saw himself as this great innovator and trailblazer. And I'm not saying he's ultimately responsible for the mess the manosphere is these days, but the idea, the kernel of the idea, was best encapsulated in his approach and the way he thought about things. And at the time, I was not a fan of what was happening, but live and let live. I'm just trying to analyze the situation here. Over time, people get older, the manosphere expands, you get a lot of PUAs in on it, you get a lot of these so-called alpha guru types who pose as life coaches. And fast forward to the present, and what do you have? You have the manosphere, which is really a term that encompasses so much. I have no idea what people really mean when they're talking about it. Are they talking about incels? Are they talking about MGTOW? Are they talking about PUAs? Are they talking about alpha guru coaches? Are they talking about fresh and fit? I don't know. What are they talking about when they talk about the manosphere? I simply do not have a clue. And this is a pretty well-known effect in general, that the broader the audience, the more massive the amount of people that you're reaching, the more diluted whatever it is you're talking about becomes, because you have to dilute everything in order to reach as many people as possible. I'm not claiming just because something is niche and small and limited in its reach and its audience that it's necessarily good. It doesn't have to be. But I would argue at the time the manosphere was overall better. There were people, myself included, trying at least to provide some kind of insight into human nature, into male and female interactions, into what it actually feels like to be a man in this world. And I think one of the great ironies with the mainstreamification of the manosphere is that you typically don't get that exploration. The irony here is actually the fact that incels most readily talk about their state of mind, their feeling as a male given a particular status. That's not something you usually hear about. Usually it's how to get laid, how to become an alpha, blah, 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 how to become a millionaire. That's the kind of crap that people associate with the quote-unquote red pill, quote-unquote manosphere. Much less introspective, much less thoughtful, much less reflective. And again, the irony is that on average, at least, the incel black pillosphere within the so-called manosphere, if you wish to term it such, is the group that is typically more reflective of this stuff. Or it might not be an irony at all, because typically when you are on the losing end of something, you spend time thinking about the facts as to why you are on the losing end of this particular thing. And these days, with the exception of what I mentioned, there's very little of that because it just doesn't have mainstream appeal. Because thoughtfulness, introspection doesn't sell, it doesn't have mass appeal. It's the same reason why intricate computer RPGs will never be massively popular, because there's too many rules involved, it's too complicated, blah, 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 blah. Same thing applies here, same thing applies to everything. And on top of that, you have the fact that the generational shift is massive. I've talked about this before, but the difference between my generation and my father's generation is pretty big. But you look at the people who grew up online, for whom 9/11, for example, is history. There's a guy I know online that jokes, and when he talks to somebody who's too young, he asks them, what was your job when 9/11 happened? And if they turn out that they didn't have a job, you get the joke, right? But these people are so young that a lot of this stuff is just history to them. And then you fast forward, and the dating and mating market has changed. Back then, a lot of the manosphere was composed of, unfortunately, men who had been divorced, men who had been violated in the divorce court. Now, not so much. In fact, very few people talk about the still ever-present danger of the divorce court loaded gun, etc., that she can just divorce you on a whim, and that it carries a lot of existential risk. That's not a major talking point these days. Instead, they talk about how to get a girlfriend, how to get laid, looks maxing, because that seems like a distant concern, even though it's still a present concern, because Zoomers, 20-something, teen-something, they have no idea about that, and the older stuff doesn't appeal to them, because they're not interested in that type of insight, they're not interested in that type of discussion, they're interested in the immediate. How do you max out reproductively, in some overarching sense, in the modern dating market in 2023? Well, that is very different even from 2013, still more different from 2003, and totally different from 1993. In order to appeal to the broadest amount of people, the manosphere has turned into something that, for many of us, is a bit unrecognizable, which on some level is fine. People should be free to do what they want to do. But you have to admit it lacks a certain sincerity. Look, for example, at the branch of the manosphere that I term dating gurus or life coaches. Now, I'll tell you what the problem is with some of these people. It's very simple. There are two possibilities for such individuals who run channels or run websites telling you how to live your life. They're either delusional enough that they believe they actually have all of human existence and life figured out, in which case it's a big red flag, or alternatively, there are only two possibilities here. They are con men who know they have not got everything figured out, but they're trying to tell you it anyway. I don't know which is worse, the delusional guy who really thinks that he's an ascended god, or the guy selling you rotten sandwiches claiming that they're fresh deli sandwiches. I'm not sure which it is. And the only way I could argue it's truly helpful is that lots of people know about it. Is the information good? Not so sure. Do people have good intentions, say the people of the sort that I've just mentioned? Probably not. It's really hard to say. But I would say overall, not because I'm from way back in the day, but overall, when things completely veer away from what they originally were, which is the natural course of things, change is the only constant in life, you lose a lot. That's just normal. You invariably lose something. And the question is that good? Is it bad? I'm not so sure. Because ultimately the question is subjective. For example, the only channel that I've discovered in recent years that I'm a huge fan of, in general, is Pete's channel. That guy Pete that you always invite to gatherings. He's the only channel I can think of. Is he part of the new coalition of red pill gurus? No. He's a normal guy. It's relatable. He's very reflective. It's my kind of content in general. I don't always agree with him, but it's my kind of content. And that's a totally subjective call. So ultimately, the way you judge whether mainstreamification, whether it's the manosphere or otherwise, is a good thing depends on your personal values. For me personally, I do not think mainstreamification has been good for the manosphere. I think it's dumbed it down a lot. I think a lot of its key ethos has been lost. But hey, that's my personal subjective opinion. There are other people who probably love the changes, love that everyone's heard of it, love that the red pill now is known to even normies or whatever. I'm sure they think it's great. I don't happen to agree with them, but it is what it is. And people could make similar arguments for games, for food, you name it. This isn't an objective question. But from my vantage point, it definitely has been deleterious. I wish it hadn't been so, and I don't think it's gone in a good direction. Now, I am curious about what you guys think about the evolution of the manosphere over the past decade, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of differing opinions on this, and I'm interested in hearing about them all. But as always, special thanks to my patrons, donors to the channel. You keep the channel going. And if I'm still alive and I recover from this foul pestilence, which is still ravaging me, I will probably check you out later, and may the gods truly watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.